Fantastic. That's okay. Yeah, thanks, Andy. Do I need a mic? Can you hear me all right? All good? Great. It's just one less thing for me to get tangled up in. Firstly, thank you for the invitation. It's an absolute pleasure to be here in Preston. It's a place, well, particularly a course I've heard so much about for decades. So to actually be here is fantastic. I know the theme is creative journeys, but I'm much better talking about the work than myself. So the briefest of my history, which is incredibly simple. I'm one of the partners at dutch.scot, and we're going to be 10 years old this summer, which seems a bit mad. I feel like we're only about 2. But prior to that, I spent 11 years at an incredible agency called Hat-Trick Design. And before that, I graduated from Norwich Art School, and I think Norwich is a very similar course, I think, to Preston, in that it's really kind of love of the ideas, the big ideas, and still very much is today, still very much something that we absolutely practice and believe in. But I think when I went to Norwich 20 years ago, it was like Norwich, Somerset, Preston, Falmouth, and actually not that much has changed really, which I think is a huge testament to kind of this course and the teaching that you guys get. So yeah, I'm going to try and blast through as many projects as possible, basically. This is where we work. So we're in the design district in North Greenwich in London, actually just in the little corner at the back of this rather grand looking building. We're a team of 6. So there's 3 partners. The name comes from the other 2 partners, although it's quite a nice sort of trinity really. One of them's half Dutch, one's half Scottish, and I came up with the name, so I think it's like the perfect kind of mix really. But yeah, and then we've got 3 designers. And actually, the design district was our client before it became our home, and it's been there now for almost 5 years, but it's essentially kind of a new creative community in London. It's amazing architecturally, and we were actually doing all of the signage for the design district before, they basically gave us the sales pitch and said, "You fancy moving in?" Which we did, and it's now a great place to work. But before it was all built, I basically went in for a meeting and saw this architectural model, which really did look remarkably like this. And I just personally fell in love with the shapes and the materials of the building. It's like, it just doesn't kind of really look real. It was a proper creative playground, I think, the brief for the architects. And there were 8 architects, and they designed 2 buildings each. And they weren't allowed to have any contact with each other. So the idea was that although it's a master plan, they wanted no real synergy. They wanted a contrast between the buildings, and they were really given free rein. So, I mean, we just had this incredible kind of starting point really for the signage, that, you know, whether it was the kind of the materials or the finish or the shape or the shapes of the windows, we started distilling that down into kind of these, you know, in their basic forms, like what were their recognizable features for the symbols. So in this case, it was like these sort of unusual tapered windows. This building has got this sort of undulating facade, which we carried through, and sort of very narrow windows. In the middle is this canteen, which basically looks like a cloud. And so we rolled that out across the system of all the buildings, but then, and it had this sort of alphanumeric system. It's funny with signage because it's one of the many things that we do as an agency. We're certainly not specialists, and I really do respect the specialist nature of signage. We approach it very much, I think, as graphic designers, you know, as ever. It's like, what ideas can we bring to it? But there is an awful lot of, obviously, kind of rigor and system to it. But for us, it was like, okay, I wanted to almost recreate that architectural model on the kind of hero signs themselves. And so we got to work with this amazing production company called Standard 8. And as much as possible, we were faithful to the building materials as well. So using actual building materials for these little models, which end up on the kind of, the main signs as you enter the design district. And we were in the pub last night, some of us. And I was so relieved to hear that like it's still the same process that we believe in that's taught here, which is write all your ideas down before you get like on the Mac. And I think this is the sort of kind of one of many examples of really it's like that briefing session of seeing that model and writing that idea down before we got into research, before we started looking at references, before you get on Pinterest and everything else. I think it's so hard to do original thinking now. And whether anything is truly original is, you know, probably questionable, but I think it's the easiest way to get as close to originality as possible. Because, you know, we all get sucked into that trap otherwise of like, well, that, you know, I like the way they've done that, and start sort of cherry picking. And that is part. Was I connected to Bluetooth? Yeah, so I think that it's, and I remember going to a talk by an ad guy, and again, for a slightly different reason, he said that every time he gets a brief, he writes everything he knows about that product and that brand and that client before he starts actually doing the research and again getting into it, because that's what the audience know, that's their level of knowledge, that has always stuck with me. Sometimes I think we can get so carried away by the research, and we, you know, there's something really like deep and buried, but it's like, will that actually ever connect with people? What is it gonna communicate? Sorry, that's the first tangent and sort of rambling that, you know, probably the first of many. But again, it was really reassuring to hear that, and I absolutely sort of, resonate with the fact that it's like, do the sketching, do the ideas, write the list before you get on the Mac. So yeah, we had the little models, and then actually, again, when you've got good clients, I think they were like, we don't want it to look corporate. If anything, we want it to feel like a village notice board. And we quite literally were like, well, actually, yeah, let's kind of take this sort of triangular form, which also reflects the design district logo, which is something that identity had already been done, that we were working with, but we had great components to work with. So yeah, the shape of the logo became this kind of notice board, then with all the little buildings like stuck on. Unfortunately, quite a few of those got crowbarred off gradually over time. But, you know, I'm going to take that as like, you know, other people loved those little buildings as much as we did. But for us, it was like, by using the material and form also functionally, it's like it makes it easier for people to navigate, which is obviously the purpose of signage. And then I quite enjoyed some of these moments where you start to see the little building C3 with the, you know, the other one in the background. And we had this little sort of pinning vernacular, which I'll come back to, which again was a nod to the sort of creative community. But yeah, these were sort of dotted around all the kind of main entrances into the district. And then we wanted to do this sort of finger post system. Again, these sort of like village signs, but very much a sort of modern take on that. So they were like, again, color-coded, powder-coated, and sort of wrap around existing street furniture. We had absolutely not, we can put anything in the ground, so we had to be quite resourceful on how we got signage onto things or into things that sort of already existed. And we quite like this one that ended up in the centre. It just felt actually quite sculptural, just because there's so many of them sort of pointing you in every direction. And yeah, so essentially 16 buildings, and then they were like groups of 4 with these little courtyards. So we followed this system through, and working with the typeface Mabry, we kind of just created these big letters for those courtyards. So you kind of arrive at each of those destinations, you have this lovely sort of 3-dimensional letter. And again, you sort of just see these as you're sort of approaching the site from every direction. Appleby Yard is our building. We're in building A4, which I love as a graphic designer. Still haven't done anything for the moving card, but you know, it'll be there one day. And yeah, I think that again, the production partner on this were brilliant. They just like, everything was so beautifully made. And I think for us, so much of the excitement of the process of it rolling out is like when you get these shots of like, you know, the skeletons in the studio, kind of the sort of behind the scenes of it all. But as I said, we also had this pinning technique, so really to talk to like creative community, not that anyone is, you know, a lot of people aren't really necessarily doing this or working in this way, but a simple distillation of how we could bring this like layering and something that feels like it's reflective of research and curating and stuff, creative practice into essentially the building signs themselves. And then these layer up the color coding, obviously the names as well as the symbols. And again, you get these sort of nice moments kind of where you see the sort of building symbols with the apertures of the buildings themselves right up to the front door. And then as you get inside, the directories follow this same sort of layering principle. I mean, one of the really big challenges through this project was it was during COVID, and I think for signage you really need to walk through the site, and we couldn't do that. We basically just had to do like everything remotely. I also had a baby during this project, so yeah, it had its challenges along the way, but it was a really lovely one to work on, and the client was brilliant. And again, we then took this sort of arrow device inside the building to create all the big stairwell arrows which sort of point you to the different floors. And then we extended the Mabry typeface into iconography, you know, trying to make those symbols really feel like they're part of the typeface. Again, kind of all the sort of system bits of detail that you have to do through a project like this. And then even down to the sort of utilities, we still use this little pinning technique. Even all the way down to sort of like toilet doors, and they can still layer up when you have multiple kind of ones within one space. So yeah, that's the first one. On to the next project, which was a Danish textile brand that we worked on a couple of years ago. It was founded by a previous client of ours that we'd worked with in London, and then she relocated to Copenhagen. And she essentially wanted us to do something a bit different for the Danish market. But essentially, and there was an article written about this, that we were trying to push that, but the journalist said, ultimately the products are really Danish. They're very very Scandinavian, very restrained. There was no pattern, there was no colour. The only thing we really had to work with was the texture. And I had remembered an exhibition that I'd been to several years before, I think, which was an Annie Albers exhibition at Tate Modern. And I had really fallen in love with some of these like typewriter textile patterns. And I think it's such a great example. I've got a terrible memory for lots of things, but I think it's a really good example of like how important that kind of archive is for the things that you've seen that might come back years later and become kind of like relevant to something that you're doing in a project. And for me, it just felt like such a great starting point for this one, that it's like, how do we essentially imbue the textures of the textiles using type. So here we started playing with the name, emulating elements of the weaves. There's also a really nice opportunity to get the typewriter out, which had been gathering dust on the shelf for years. And again, I think this is another good example of like, get analog, I think, as much as possible. I mean, obviously, it's not always relevant, but actually there are always things, I think, that you do in those analog experiments that like often carry through to the final thing. So that's something that we often do at the beginning, or like part of the image making process, whether it's painting or printing or drawing. And at some point, the name changed from Meteco to Temeko, which ordinarily I think would be an absolute nightmare because you might be doing something with M's but thankfully it was very easy to just reorder it. It all kind of, the system didn't fall apart, it worked. So yeah, we did loads of these. And then once we started getting the actual textiles through, and the client, because it's quite unusual, I think, really, and but the client really loved it, and I think ultimately I went to a talk last week that was like basically saying the onus is on you to articulate the idea well enough, sell the idea well enough. Unsurprisingly, he was an ad man who I think are obviously very good at that. And you can't say that the client didn't buy it. That's on you. But I think we all know that it's like when you have a client that comes to you with the brief, that the starting point is that they want to do something a bit different. You know they share that value. Then you're kind of halfway there. Sometimes they just don't buy it. And but I think that the sort of the reasoning why it's different in the kind of sector and why it's distinctive, I think, all of that is sort of so important. Anyway, back to the graphics. We did this little kind of woven swatch in its own right for the logo. And we also came up with a bit of a sort of mantra for the whole project and the products, which was this Fabrics for Life. And this was because they were creating something that they wanted, that had real longevity. They're sort of high quality, but also we liked it as the sort of like they're for every day, they're not for special occasions. So these elements of life kind of come through, especially kind of more in the art direction. So we tried lots of typewriter fonts, once we got into doing this digitally, but we did go back to the Olivetti, and there was a sort of geometry and a cleanness to Zante that just worked really well for the patterns themselves. I had a sort of slight moment where I just didn't really like the S though in this typeface, so we did go back to the typographer and just asked if he could tweak that, and thankfully he just took that on board and did it. But we also work a lot with Nick Askery, who's an amazing copywriter. He did these beautiful poems for us. They're quite weird, some of them. Less so these two first ones, but I think, again, it testament to the sort of client. I think it was this last one. She was like, I don't really get it, but okay, fine. And yeah, I think it's another sort of layer to the identity. So we had the fabrics, but we really craved something that moved and behaved like fabric. And we had an intern in at the time who was really good in Blender. I hadn't even heard of Blender. And we just gave him 2 weeks, basically, to test a lot of this stuff out. And we really fell in love with it because we were like, all of a sudden, we're taking something really analog and making it digital. It had this physicality. And again, I mean, it's just part of the beauty of, I think, of like when you love it and you just run with it and you keep trying more. And I would always encourage, like, you're encouraged to do that a lot as a student, but I would always encourage that throughout, I think, just like, because I think these additional elements are amazing for clients. And then we took stills from the motion back into static form. So you kind of have that form back into those sort of images themselves. We kind of wanted the label just to sort of sit directly on the product, so it almost feels like a little kind of zoom in, that kind of woven texture on woven texture. The guidelines were all done kind of like in A4, almost like they were done on a typewriter. And it was really nice once we got into, started getting these printed elements back and overlaying them on the fabrics, how they would appear, in a as a customer when you sort of purchase them. And then we were also doing the art direction, which is a bit of the project which I really love. Like, I think it's not, it's quite a leap really from graphic design, but actually, again, trying to take elements of concept or originality or reference into the art direction, I think it's really fun. And you get to work often with great photographers and stylists. In this case, we worked with a photographer who was based between Copenhagen and Porto, and then a stylist who was also an artist in her own right. Like, quite a lot of these ceramic elements that became part of the shoot she'd made. But we wanted them to have this artful, surreal quality, but with these signs of life. Those things were kind of like, the textiles were like crumpled and wrinkled. And again, something we talked about in the pub last night, the importance of sketching. Anna in our team is actually really good at it, but you don't have to be brilliant asset, but don't be scared of it. Like, I think you really need it as a way of communicating ideas. And again, not just relying on reference. It's like, something that you found. It's like, what's your interpretation of it? What's the, and thinking about, particularly for shoots, I think, like, what's the composition, what you're trying to achieve. And this is not post-rationalized. This, I can't, like, actually, it's pretty close, I think, the sketch to the reality, even though this photo shoot did go a bit off-piece, but I'll come back to that. But I think I was much better at drawing than I am now, because I don't do it enough. So I don't practice what I preach all the time. But I remember when I was interning at Hattrick, like 20 years ago, and they realised I was quite good at drawing, and I drew this whole presentation on a tablecloth, which was quite sort of scary, really, with a permanent marker. But I think you can quickly really try and demonstrate some of these other skills that you have, whether it's a passion for photography, printmaking. Anna, who's good at drawing in our team, is also excellent at printmaking. That came out in another project. Or, as I said, with like the other intern that we had, Reese, who was really good at Blender. Like, as small teams, we only have so many skills. So, like, I think you always have an opportunity to bring extra skills to the table. Again, the sort of like before and after, there were just some really, it's quite dark on here, but there was some really like weird, again, like these ceramic clogs, like just weird little things that the stylist brought to it that I loved, and all this sort of strange marble fruit for no real reason other than just looked good. And we essentially created all of the furniture and sets out of these blocks. We quite liked the idea that could be very rigid and gridded and architectural, and then it sort of really juxtaposes with the softness of the textiles. But yeah, I had a bit of a hairy moment. We'd been planning this for ages. The shoot was quite expensive. The client was a bit nervous about the investment, but was ultimately on board. And then the day before I was about to sort of fly to Copenhagen, like 2 hours later or something, the client said, the products haven't actually arrived. I was like, what? We've been planning this shoot for months. Like, this is madness. And she was like, I think we're going to have to cancel. I was like, you can't cancel. You won't get the money back. You've got samples. Let's go for it. And thankfully, we had a 2-day shoot. And over the course of the 2 days, all of the products gradually arrived in dribs and drabs. But I think what was really lovely is actually there were lots of sort of happy accidents, therefore, not the spillages, that was deliberate. But I think we suddenly had this creative freedom where we turned up and it was like, let's just have a play, let's just experiment. Some of the shots, as you've seen, were planned and played out in the way that we'd hoped and expected, but actually quite a lot of it was done just in the moment, and it was such a joy for that. And I think, again, as designers, we have a tendency to be, or maybe I'm just talking about myself, be very controlling. We want to sort of control and plan every element and not leave anything to chance. But things are always going wrong. And I think actually that adaptability is one of our biggest kind of assets and strengths. And I think the bumps in the road often bring those sort of pleasant surprises. There's shots in this selection that we just wouldn't have got if we hadn't had that sort of last minute curveball and kind of given ourselves a bit of that sort of freedom to explore. And what's, again, was quite nice is, like, I think as we had done lots of research, we were quite interested in some of the sort of Louise Bourgeois stuff at some stage, and the client, but it wasn't part of the plan, and then the client was like, I'm going to get in the bed. It's like, okay, go for it. And yeah, so it was, it had this really open feeling of like everyone was just chucking ideas in, trying stuff, and yeah. It was great. It was great fun. And similarly, I was like, I wanted to do something with the glass. I wanted to make it feel like a window, maybe have a reflection. And then the stylist was like, well, how about we make it look like the cushions are sort of holding it up, and it had, again, this sort of surreal quality. I don't know if surreal comes up here, but that was I was taught by a man called Ray Gregory. And it was like, if in doubt, make it surreal. Still think that works quite well, actually. And there were just little things like, again, this sort of melty ceramic that I felt like it was like melting into the kind of floor. And then, when you start pairing the imagery with the poems, I think it was sort of really nice to start seeing how all of these elements come together. We had these lovely boxes made, which again ended up being part of the photo shoot, which was really nice for us. But these boxes, my God, did they end up being a labour of love for the client. They essentially wanted something that people would really want to keep, but we wanted to do something that almost, again, had this utilitarian quality and, again, came back to sort of like typewriters and a bit archival. So we loved these boxes that had, you know, those kind of studs, and but the client was trying to get them made by the factory that make the textiles in India. I was like, it's not going to work. They're not going to be able to do it. They're not going to. And they were like, oh no, it's okay. They, you know, they just need a spec. It's like, no, you need somebody. We could get some samples made and they could replicate. Anyway, 9 months later, the factory couldn't make what we wanted or anyone wanted. So they got a box maker in Copenhagen who just make these types of boxes, and they've been there for 130 years to make the boxes. They're screen printed, everything is made by hand. They are so expensive that the price of the products had to go up to absorb some of the costs. But I think for us, it was just like they were kind of everything we hoped for and more. And actually people asked to buy just the boxes, which I think annoys the textile designers, but it's quite nice for us as the graphic designers. But part of the joy for me, I think, is also like when you hand it over and the client starts doing it and they roll it out, and they did the website, they did this catalogue, and they're just doing such a great job of it. But also it's going to their retail partners. This is one in Taiwan. This is another kind of retail partner in Switzerland, and like they are using the boxes as like point of sale, like they're in window displays, they're on the shelves. And I'm just going to finish up this one with another one of Nick's beautiful poems. He actually just like typeset this in his Word doc. He just animated it. But I think I feel like language is such an important part of what we do. So I think whenever you get an opportunity to work with copywriters, good ones, do it. Because I also think in the rise of like, we're seeing so much writing now done by like ChatGPT, and it's really slick. It doesn't have that human quality. It doesn't have charm. It doesn't have warmth. It doesn't get brands. It doesn't have ideas. Like, it's such a great asset, I think. This next project is a restaurant in Sardinia called Tanit. It's a really weird photo that I'm not quite sure what. I mean, going back to art direction, when some of this stuff came back, I was like, I'm not quite sure what possessed them to hold this plate of food. It looked like they're about to sort of frisbee it off into the port. But yeah, this was a branding project, again, for us, website design for the restaurant, which is a sector that we do quite a lot of work in. I started with my research with watching an episode by Stanley Tucci on Sardinia. And again, I think for me, it's like, I mean, I love the research bit. But I think, again, it's like trying to make that research as varied as possible. I have to say I don't often watch stuff on BBC for research purposes, but sometimes it is beneficial. But again, I think getting away from the usual suspects of Instagram and Pinterest, I think the more original your starting points for research, again, probably the more original the sort of solutions are going to be. You know, I often try and get a book. I've got a book in my bag at the moment, which I bought for a particular project, or like go to an exhibition, go to a museum, go to a gallery. And I think it's a much more enjoyable way of doing research, actually, the more kind of first-hand you can do it. We spend so much time in front of the computer. It's good to get away from it as much as possible. But essentially, there was a restaurant already there called Tanit. And Tanit is a goddess of the Phoenician times, and was associated with quite a lot of like symbology and rituals and sort of folklore. And we kind of loved, when we started looking at the Phoenician alphabet, we were like, I think there's something that we could do here. And essentially we created a bespoke typeface which mixed Roman and Phoenician letter forms. This project hasn't been properly documented, so it's a little bit kind of raw in places, but it's quite an affluent area of Sardinia, but we really wanted to do something that was bold and had this like rawness, because I think equally like Sardinia is sort of renowned for this rugged beauty. And the whole typeface was like, as well as the logo itself, was like dotted with this symbolism. So the T is like a take on the symbol of Tanit. And then we had stuff like Mem, which is like water, because it was in this fjord. And the fish, because it's a predominantly sort of seafood restaurant. And again, a bit like Fabrics for Life, I think, I wouldn't say these are sort of strap lines or taglines or even necessarily customer facing in this case, but I think having a way of describing the idea, so this sort of ancient language, new voice, we thought was quite a nice vehicle for this one. My dad taught graphic design, and he always said to me, if you can't explain the idea over the phone in a few words, it doesn't work. And again, I feel like that's something that stayed with me as a bit of a test. And this was, again, poetry, again, Nick. The Sardinians are sort of like famous for it, and it's such a nice way, I think, of bringing sort of storytelling, but loath to use that word because it's a bit overdone, but into the brands. And we had a quite funny conversation, because actually they were a bit nervous about us coming up with a brand when we're based in London and they're in Sardinia. I had never been to Sardinia. They were like, how can you really capture the place? I was like, well, that's our job as designers. But they had a similar thing with Nick. It's like, he's based sort of in the UK as well. And they were like, how is he going to write about Sardinia when he's not here? But anyway, at one point during the process, they were like, we think you've got to just come here and experience it for yourself. And it's like, twist my arm. And I basically ended up spending 2 days eating and drinking with the team over there, which was joyful. And this is a picture of the marketing manager and her dad, who's a sommelier. And we spent an afternoon at a wine tasting festival, which was, this is one of the perks of the job, I think. Doesn't always happen, doesn't often happen properly. But there was this element of like, so we presented that original logo, but they were like, oh, we want more of the coast in there. So we did this secondary logo, which used the symbol elements, brought these palms in, the water in, the fish. And actually, like, we ended up using this so much more than the other logo. And I think it's a really good example of like, you always want to present a client, for the client to go, oh my God, I love it. It doesn't happen. It's maybe happened once, twice in 10 years, I feel like. And I think, but it's like, if you can temper that sort of disappointment, because I'm really like, I think I'm just ultimately a people pleaser. So I have to sort of temper the disappointment when it's like, the buts, and you can tell they're not sure. But I think, like, often it gets better. You know, you push it together, they challenge you, it gets richer. So take on the criticism as much as possible, and just, so long as it takes you on that journey to a better destination, it's all part of the process, I think. So yeah, essentially we had this little guy that kind of like flips between the two on stuff like the website, and that you can actually roll over the logo on the website. It's quite satisfying, and it sort of goes between the two. So we commissioned, as I said, the typeface, which had these alternates, the sort of Phoenician alternates. We did that with commercial type, as well as the illustrative glyphs. So this was called Tanit Terza, based on this original by commercial type called Terza Reader, which became the secondary typeface. And yeah, it was quite pleasing with some of these stuff, like when you then actually kind of like type it out and how it's the sort of the behavior. And these are some of those typefaces from Nick in the typeface, which again they're used in the menus. There's one about food, they're used on the website, but also kind of just like get to the heart of kind of what's sort of really special about that place and that location. And then there was one about Tanit herself, and we typeset this so it was a bit reminiscent of that sort of Nora Stone. So again, I think that sort of research, it's like you kind of want to keep going back to the research and borrowing things from it and seeing what else there is that you can do with that. Ignore the imagery on this, it needs to be updated, but this was just kind of like, again, some of how it sort of played out on the website. Stock video. We don't want that. I had this desire where I was like, do you think you could film like a fisherman in that moment where he sort of hooks the fish out of the water? I don't think that's been captured, sadly, but I think that would be a nice moment. And we did patterns. So again, you know, just like push it. These ended up on uniforms. The client, as you probably saw in that previous shot, is very into Louis Vuitton. So this one felt a bit kind of Louis Vuitton for her. These were used on sort of menu linings, and again, they end up around the kind of edges of plates and really weird oyster version of the Tanit symbol that we had nothing to do with. This next project, what am I doing for time? When do I need to stop? Okay, good. So this launched last summer. Again, it's not properly documented. Story of our life. I don't think we documented anything last year, and now it's a bit of a sort of feat. But basically, we received this email invitation to take part in a paid pitch for the graphic identity of the Horta Museum. First thing we did was Google the Horta Museum. And it turned out it was this UNESCO World Heritage Site in Brussels. And it was essentially like the home and the atelier of this architect, Victor Horta, who is a prominent like Art Nouveau architect. I sort of described him in the studio as like the Gaudi of Brussels. We never said that to the client because I think they'd be mildly offended. But he designed loads of buildings in Brussels, lots of which have subsequently been destroyed, which is devastating. Like Art Nouveau, by all accounts, fell out of fashion so rapidly that they were just like floored these buildings, which just feels like sacrilege now. But thankfully, this one survived, and yeah, it's absolutely stunning. Like if you're ever in Brussels, I really recommend going to it because it is. It's a beautiful building and it's a really wonderful experience. They have changing exhibitions as well where they kind of work with contemporary artists, but all the furniture, everything was designed by Victor Horta. They recently did a collaboration with Hermes, so there's now a sort of Horta Hermes scarf, which I asked if they could send us one. They didn't. But the level of sort of craftsmanship was just, yeah, incredible. This was their previous identity. It had been around since the 80s. It's got a bit of an 80s, more of an 80s vibe possibly than an Art Nouveau one. But it was centered around this butterfly motif, which was like in some of the wallpaper, which we just read as an elephant. And then we could never unsee the elephant. But there was no real system, but they were very nervous about actually getting rid of it because some people were very connected to it. They wanted to see two routes, so one that evolved the existing identity and then one that they described as the free option, which was essentially that we had a kind of a blank slate. So they went over to do a tour. I love this little thing of like, rather than a sign that says don't sit on the chairs, they have these really spiky shelves. It's just really like, again, lovely details. Like everything is very... There's very little kind of intervention in the building in terms of signage and graphics. You know, it's very light touch. And so that balancing act was something that we had to be really aware of. You know, whilst it kind of is a museum, it was ultimately his house and they still want it to feel like a house. They obviously want to protect it, but they want to share it with people. But this past and future thing was also really... They didn't want to stay in the past, you know, they want to show their relevance for today and the future and engage future generations and audiences. So this was, you know, something that we really had to kind of keep in mind. So for the first route, obviously trying to work out what we do with the elephant / butterfly, using the usual, like, well, how first and foremost can we sort of tidy it up? But this was essentially what that route ended up looking like, of trying to bring some systems, visual elements from, you know, obviously kind of Art Nouveau, but trying to make it feel more contemporary, albeit using gold, which was one of the prerequisites of that first route. And then route 2 came a bit more, so our free option came a bit more from Horta's process. So there were all of these kind of amazing sketches because as I said, it was his house and then his workshop. And we found all these little like H's as part of these sketches that we were like, oh, well, that feels like a good starting point. So we quite liked the idea of them bringing one of these sketches to life, which looked a bit like this. And again, this is kind of how that second route ended up looking and being presented. Then we got this, which we enjoyed. So we got 58 out of 60 for creativity, which, you know, was a nice moment for us. A little kind of sort of pat on the back moment, but we had this as well. So basically they didn't really know which one to go for. So even though I think we demonstrated like creativity, they weren't convinced by either direction or which way to go. So we had to sort of prove that Route 2 could work, but they weren't convinced with how it looked. And if I'm honest, I don't think we were either, to be honest. So we were like, okay, how do we go back? Started looking for more inspiration. Is it more fluid? Again, some people will be familiar with these sort of Dover Street books, like looking at monograms, looking, sketching, looking, exploration. Went back to sort of wider typographic references. I don't know if anyone here has been to the St Bride Foundation in London, but it's got the biggest type specimens collection in the world. I'm a trustee there. It's a phenomenal place. Next time you're in London, try and do a tour. Again, for typographic research, to go to those origins, I think is incredible. So we started doing more of this. We quite like this letterbox on the front door that we were like, oh, we must be able to do something with that type. But we were like, oh, no, that just doesn't look very good. We were struggling, and I think we were just like, by this point, we were completely paralyzed. We were just like, we tried so much. We had no idea really what was right. I think the pressure was getting to us. We didn't want to do something. We didn't want to try and emulate Horta himself. So we'd hit a brick wall, and actually Jake and I were on the train up to Liverpool for another project, which I'm going to talk about in a bit, but we got this email from Owen, one of our designers. Owen is fluent in French and was basically Googling in French to see what else he could find. And he found stuff that we couldn't find originally in English, which I thought was kind of amazing. And so we were going through this, and I remember Jake going, oh my God, he's found, what's this? H-shaped keyhole. And essentially, we opened it up and we were like, wow, this is something that exists that he had designed, Horta had designed and made, which we were like, well, can you get anything better for the Horta Museum, which is essentially a house? So then all of a sudden, we were like, okay, that's the symbol. It kind of feels like it's this kind of protecting and sharing. And so we drew that up. All of a sudden, all the skepticism from everyone, including ourselves, was like, had fallen away. And this was kind of like a good reminder for us that it's like, rather than slogging away at something, it's like, then sometimes you do have to open up that search and look a bit further and delve a bit deeper. And for this type of project, I think it's like, it's less about kind of originating something rather than finding something and then, you know, how you kind of draw it up and utilize it. It's a very different project for us, I think, because, you know, there's quite a lot of restraint in it, which is not something that comes naturally to us. And we paired that with this contemporary typeface Pangaea that had these Art Nouveau qualities. The colours are actually very much from that era, but had a freshness and a warmth to them, which we really liked. So starting to look at the sort of typographic system. Again, we wanted to do layouts that were, you know, not kind of bombastic, but had a bit of like contemporary flair in the way that they were executed. And then actually, like, we did a bit of light touch work on the website, but they mostly took it themselves. They had all this like beautiful video content that they'd commissioned, which again, sort of really nice way that it came to life. Just to summarize that one, the sort of like graphic system that was basically executed for that. This one is another restaurant. This is by an Argentinian chef called Fernando Trocker. And we really wanted to make this identity about all the sort of European immigration in kind of Argentina. And we, you know, there was this desire, it's amazing the building in London that this is in, that it's like, we wanted to get this feel of like that cafe culture where you might go in the morning and somebody's having a coffee at the bar, and then you might go in the evening, that same person's having a brandy at the bar, and, you know, it's a real kind of like melting pot of people and life and sort of history. But yeah, this building in London where Secret is was an old music hall, and it's like over 300 years old. So we felt like there was something in that kind of synergy, which was nice. And we essentially wanted for this to try and create a logotype that was bespoke, that had this, took all these references from European signage, but like a medley of different sort of influences. So we were just picking bits out that, you know, characters that we like, starting to put those together, this sort of like smiley E, the kind of, we didn't really know what we're doing. You know, we're not, I'm really conscious, we're not sort of experts in typography. We do it all the time, day in, day out, but we just sort of felt our way kind of to the result. And again, I think this is, you know, a slightly different style of thinking where it's subtle and nuanced, but ultimately it was like there's a bit of French in there, a bit of Italian, a bit of Spanish, you know, there's a sort of wonky kind of charm and sort of personality and elegance to it that just imbues a bit of a feeling in the place. And it's actually probably one of the logos that I think is kind of most loved, like certainly by, you know, almost like non-designers or people outside of hospitality even. And then we brought these elements of kind of like the menu sort of dances around the layout. And I think, you know, we're often scared of cliches, but I'm pretty sure it's Alan Fletcher that said, you know, to stroke a cliche until it purrs like a metaphor. And I think, you know, it is so true. Like, you know, we were looking at sort of Argentinian tango. It's like, oh God, it's such a cliche. But we then found these, essentially the sort of tango moves, like in diagrammatic form, which we were just like, well, they're really lovely. So we started to sort of bring these to life in these kind of linear elements that dance around, you know, graphically kind of on the website, but also used decoratively, but they're also used part of the storytelling in the wine menu. And then we had this secondary logo, which references that a little bit. And the idea with this secondary logo is, again, because of the history of the building, we wanted something that felt a bit like a relic. You know, it's almost like these two logos that are sort of knocking around. The interiors had these references to sort of Andean kind of colours and patterns, and so we took those colour palettes through to the bar menus. And then we had these illustrative elements within those. And for the illustrations, again, going back to the sort of original sketches, we wanted these moments of life in Argentina, the people watching, those visual observations and sort of parallels that you can kind of start to see. They're playful and sort of whimsical and charming. So it's like the person that's sort of like keeled over at the bar, but is doing quite an elegant tango move with the legs. And, you know, then some of it was like using elements of the windows of the building to do kind of like old and new, like multi-generational. And again, I think like illustration is a big part of what we do or what we commission. And I think as bringing, again, as many details as possible that are ownable to that particular client or location is really important to us. This was a porteño. He's like a port person from sort of Buenos Aires, featuring the client's dog Otto. That's always kind of a win for clients. The creme caramel we thought looked like the hat. And we quite liked this sort of like delicately, the sort of burly dock worker sort of delicately holding the little sort of espresso, the tango legs. And as I said, we use those linear elements to then tell this story of ultimately the immigration, the kind of the starting point, which very much then played into the wine menu and obviously kind of the sort of old world to new, essentially. And this is how it all came together on the website. again, this project has kind of been on a kind of interesting journey of its own. So we laboured over this identity probably for a couple of years, wanting to create something that we felt could be there for decades. And 3 years later, they rebranded. We were like, oh my God. It was really like actually quite a heartbreaking moment. I mean, I know it's just graphics, but when you pour your heart and soul into it, it's awful kind of when you hear that. But they've rebranded back. I only heard that about a few months ago, so we're sort of delighted to hear it's been resurrected. So, because I'm a full circle moment on that one. I think I've only got a couple left. I'll try and go quickly. So this is the Bronte. It's a youth and community centre in Liverpool. It's a real feel-good one, this. Like, it's just full of amazing people. It's a place that's just been a pillar of the community for generations. Football pitch is the hub, probably unsurprisingly. It was originally established in 1969 by a sort of prominent family, the Moore family in Liverpool. And back then it was all boys' clubs, but this, you know, that they saw that was becoming really outdated. So it was really pioneering and progressive at that time to do a centre that was actually for the whole community and not just the boys. Somehow they've managed to keep that centre open for decades through everything that's gone on, but the place is literally falling apart. They managed to basically get funding from the Youth Investment Fund to renovate the building and rebrand it, which is where we came in. And they had all these, again, like through sort of the initial research, we found all these old newsletters. These are just like pure gold for like the sort of the anecdotes. So it's like you can do all of this stuff. If you're tired, just go and lay on the grass, go to sleep. There was just so much charm, and I felt like it really captured. It's so charming, the place, and the people have just got such a great sense of humour. This one made me laugh. It's like, why was it just women that were using the plungers? But all these kind of like anecdotes that we were finding and being told, but then, you know, ultimately the kids own it. They are like the absolute bosses of this centre. They did this funding video.
Hi, I'm Lily. And I'm Alice. And welcome to the Bronte. This is Laura. Welcome to the Bronte. We are very nice. We look up future and paradise. The better place. It will be very nice. The student meeting, the floor is wet. We play a lot of sports from English spread. The telly is broken, the break is over. We need some breaks to chill and be on.
Huge amount of that I didn't understand a word, but it was fondly referred to as the chicken fried rice video. Also not quite sure why they've got green tashes drawn on, but you know, they were such, you know, to do something for those guys, again, for that next generation to sort of continue the story. So this is chapter 2. I mean, it's literally like the pitch is reopened, the centre's about to kind of, or parts of the centre are sort of reopening. We worked with this sort of local architect, Sue, who was like just fantastic to work with. And it is really like a community centre of the future. Like they want to get micro enterprises in so it can fund itself. Like it really is, it was really sort of so inspiring, kind of like their vision for the future, as well as, you know, the journey they've been on up until this point. And when we were sort of thinking about the branding, there was just this hand-rendered type everywhere. Particularly, I think, these little messages that, you know, these lovely little sort of positive messages that the kids write to each other that are dotted all over the walls. And we just felt that, like, yeah, these kind of, all these anecdotes and the language was really what the Bronte was all about. So we really like the idea of creating, again, another sort of bespoke typeface for this job that we felt would be really robust for them. I mean, a bit like the Macmillan identity, you know, giving them a bespoke typeface that then they can typeset almost anything and it becomes really ownable and easy for them to use, which is really important. One of the trustees said, you know, we're a bit messy. And again, this was a sentiment that we really felt we had to continue and sort of take on. So we went up to Liverpool, me and Owen, one of our designers, and we gave the kids a bunch of exercises to start creating this typeface. I go into these workshops terrified. Again, I think probably my controlling nature, it's like you don't know what's going to happen. But they were just prolific. They just get stuck in because there's no reservation. They got no, they just were drawing. Within an hour, I think we'd like covered this wall. And then Owen, one of our designers, like was basically getting art directed by this crew of kids who absolutely like loved it. And we essentially had just like hundreds of these post-it notes with drawings and letter forms, and it was just sort of great content. Some of the words just made me laugh, especially sort of how we're doing today, babes. But during the workshop, this was Owen's idea, and I never would have come up with this idea. People would have just been drawing on post-it notes if it was left to me. But essentially, like, we built this font live. So Owen was like photographing stuff and building this font with their sketches so that the kids could then start testing this stuff out in kind of real time. And again, I think this is a really good example of, like, you know, I think I learn probably more from our designers than they learn from me. Like you have so much opportunity to sort of bring new ways of doing things to the table. So yeah, the Bronte Fonte was born. And I mean, this is really bonkers, but we sort of really liked this sort of crude typeface that was sort of like put together in, you know, a matter of minutes. But we knew that it had to be kind of more refined than this. So yeah, it was like, how do you retain that zest and energy? But, you know, it needed a little bit of consistency. So as I say, you know, this is essentially our client team. The direction was approved, but after a bit of debate, I would say that the adults in the room were trying to second guess the kids. Don't ever do it. They will always say the opposite to what you expect. But yeah, we wanted it to still have this sort of restlessness. So we created 3 versions of each letter. We worked with Playtype in Copenhagen to bring this to life. And so as you type, it's always toggling between the different variations. So actually the behavior is there when you're working with it, which is, as you create stuff, is really fun. So everything sort of like feels a bit kind of off kilter. And then we have these different versions of the logo with this amazing imagery actually that was shot by a sort of photographer that they had a great relationship with. And then we worked with Joe Coleman, different copywriter on this one. Again, tone of voice, super important. How do you capture that warmth and spirit? And he just came back to us with like pages and pages of all these different copy lines. And again, it's quite forgiving how you put all of these elements together because it is ultimately really quite sort of single-minded. A lot of the colours were derived from the building. There's just the odd one like this, which was a bit more kind of to add a bit of pop. And then, yeah, we had all these symbols again, which kind of represent the offers as the centre. Also referencing Liverpool and kind of the location. We did these rebuses. Again, these were inspired by some of the stuff that happened in the workshops. We also did a merchandise design workshop with the kids, which was equally entertaining. These are real billboards, not mock-ups. And again, working with an amazing digital agency to then bring this to life online. But yeah, there's on that first screen, he's gone now. There's a man called Bernard who nearly brought me to tears. His wife used to run the centre, but sadly passed away. He got married in the centre. His daughter now runs the centre, and his granddaughter attends the centre. I just think it's like, it is such an incredible place, and it was such an honour and pleasure to sort of be part of the process. And I kind of just desperate for them to sort of sail into the future. And there was somebody, I think they were putting a film together, who said, it's not behaving how I want to in regards to the font. And I'm like, great. It's like, you know, it's a little bit like handling a sort of wild animal, which is exactly what we wanted. Last project, serious vibe shift. This is really quick. It's a cocktail bar in Brooklyn in New York. Went live in October. Essentially, it was inspired by Belle Epoque Paris. We wanted to do something that had this kind of, they wanted a very timeless identity, but Brooklyn's quite a cool neighborhood, so how do you balance that? We wanted to do something with this sort of French-style script. Again, going back to some Bride Foundation, looking at some original sort of type specimens, but Rev means to dream. So we were like, oh, okay, so maybe it'd be nice if we have this bit of script that essentially has this dreamlike behavior in it, and it drifts off. So that's how that kind of went, the sketch into sort of reality. So we essentially have these 3 states of the logo. And this first state is used at kind of the beginning of the customer journey. It's what you see on signage. That second state more when you get into menus, and the loosest state is sort of reserved for when you get the bill at the end of the night and you've had 5 martinis and everything's a blur. The interiors were all red, so we had this dark red to complement that, but we paired it with a light blue. And again, through our research, we found, like Joe Miro once said that blue was sort of the color of his dreams. So we kind of really liked that bit of storytelling, again, to come back to the dreams, but also it really stood out in that environment. Really desperate to get my hands on some of these bit of these sort of French style chore jackets, which they branded for their uniforms. And then another little gift really in this one, the address is 222 Smith Street. So the 222 felt like his ZZZ for, again, that sort of sleepy quality. That became the mold for the ice cubes. It's a real thing in the kind of this world. And my Instagram feed is now filled with pictures of martinis since this project. But they, as I said, it was inspired by Belle Epoque Paris. So the first volume of the cocktail menu was inspired by Impressionism, which was a prominent art movement of that time. So again, we had this sort of dreamlike quality for the typography. But when we got into the cocktail menu, there were 10 cocktails each inspired by a different Impressionist painting. So we wanted to bring that dreamlike, ramp up the Impressionist nature with this dreamlike kind of technique on the paintings, dialing up the color, pairing that with verse libre. So that was something else we found from that time, of like basically this rambling style of poetry, which we felt was very reminiscent of like recalling a dream. So the idea with this was like, you know, you've just woken up from a dream and you're trying to remember that moment in the dream, but it doesn't quite make sense. But essentially your description is somewhat related to what you're seeing in the painting. And then it's typeset in the shape of a sunflower in this case, because it's from Monet's garden, with the ingredients peppered within. So very conceptual, you know, and that was really from the client, like, and they were sort of the driving force in terms of what they wanted, the inspiration from the cocktails, but obviously then it was our job to sort of play it out and tie it back to the brand. But what I quite like is like, okay, you can read the poetry and, you know, get inspired by that to pick a cocktail, but you can equally pick it on colour or ingredients. So it's like, no, I want to drink the one that's got passion fruit in it, for example. So I think, you know, it's not, you don't have to sort of delve too deeply, but actually it seems to be going down pretty well with people. And amazingly on this one, the client had a degree in English and a passion for poetry, so he actually wrote the poetry, and it's brilliant. Thanks for listening.